Welcome to this deep dive presented by Safety One Source. We're zeroing in today on something really key for you, safety professionals, risk managers, and honestly, anyone looking to sharpen their safety knowledge in maritime.
Yeah, we're talking about OSHA regulations for longshoring and marine terminals.
Exactly. And it can feel, well, a bit complicated sometimes, right? You've got two main sets of rules, Part 1918 and Part 1917.
And they sometimes overlap, which is where things can get confusing.
Right. So our mission today is to try and bring some clarity, give you a practical understanding of which rules apply when in these industries.
For sure. If you're out there managing safety day to day in these environments, getting a solid handle on these distinctions isn't just, nice to have, it's crucial.
Absolutely essential for effective safety management.
Definitely. So we want to help you understand what governs what.
Okay, great. So let's start with the basics, lay the groundwork. What exactly is a longshoring operation in OSHA's view?
Okay, so the definition they use is pretty comprehensive. It covers loading, unloading, moving, or just generally handling cargo.
Ship stores, gear, that kind of thing.
Yep, all of that. Anything moving into, inside, onto, or off a vessel. And importantly, it also covers related employment.
Related employment, what falls under that?
Think about tasks that happen alongside or because of the longshoring. So securing cargo, rigging work, even porters, checkers, and watchmen if their work is tied to those vessel operations.
Ah, okay, so it's tied to the vessel itself.
Historically, yeah. The focus was really on the hazards specific to working right there on the water aboard the ship.
And the term vessel, it's not just big container ships, is it?
No, not at all. It's actually defined very broadly. Any watercraft, really, or artificial structure used for transport on water.
So barges, special platforms?
Exactly. Even special purpose floating structures count. Now, contrast that with a marine terminal.
Okay, what's the definition there?
That refers to the landside part.
Yeah.
Wharves, bulkheads, quays, piers, docks, the berthing locations.
And the areas around them.
Right. Adjacent storage areas, structures used for moving cargo between the ship and the shore, areas for receiving, holding, consolidating cargo or passengers, even maintenance areas for the terminal equipment.
So pretty much the whole port facility infrastructure.
Mostly, yes. But there's a key exclusion, production or manufacturing areas. If a factory has its own dock and storage, that's usually under different rules, not Part 1917.
Got it. Okay, so two distinct zones, vessel and terminal. Let's focus on longshoring first. Part 1918, that's the main one.
That's the general rule, yes. Part 1918 applies exclusively to all employment, every employee doing longshoring or related work aboard any vessel.
Aboard the vessel. Okay, but are there exceptions?
Yes, and this is a really critical one. If you're transferring cargo using shore-based material handling devices, think dock cranes.
Like the big gantry cranes.
Exactly. That specific activity, even though it involves cargo that came off a ship, is governed by Part 1917, the Marine Terminal Rules.
Ah, so it depends on where the equipment is based. Shore-based gear means 1917 rules apply for that transfer.
Precisely. That distinction is fundamental.
Okay, that's clear. But what about the general industry standards, Part 1910? Does that ever creep into longshoring ops aboard a vessel?
It does, yeah. There are specific situations where Part 1910 standards take precedence. Even under Part 1918, OSHA pulls them in for certain, fundamental safety areas.
Like what kind of areas?
Things like an employee's right to access their own exposure and medical records. That's 1910.1020.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Commercial diving operations, that falls under 1910 subpart T. And electrical safety, specifically when shore-based power is hooked up to the vessel. That's subpart S of 1910.
Interesting. So quite a few specific instances. Are there more?
Oh yeah, hazard communication, that's huge. Section 1910.120 applies.
HAZCOM, always important.
Definitely. Also, ionizing radiation, noise exposure. That's 1910.95 for noise. And non-ionizing radiation.
Non-ionizing radiation, like radar.
Exactly. And 1910.97 actually gets quite specific about exposure distances for radar. For instance, if a radar scanner is stationary while transmitting, the hazardous zone is considered 18.7 feet or less. But if it's rotating while transmitting, that distance drops way down to 5.2 feet or less.
Wow, that's very specific. Good numbers for safety folks to know. What about things like breathing protection or handling hazardous stuff?
Respiratory protection requirements also come straight from Part 1910, Section 134. And for toxic and hazardous substances, generally, it's subpart Z of 1910 that applies.
Generally. Are there caveats?
Yes, quite a few important ones. If the hazardous substance or cargo is in sealed packaging that meets Department of Transportation, DOT, or International Maritime Organization, IMO, standards.
Then it might be exempt from some 1910 rules.
Correct.
Yeah.
Also, the bloodborne pathogen standard, 1910.103 applies. And while 1910.1000 applies, and while 1910.100 covers things like carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide, but Part 1918 itself has specific sections, 1918.94A for CO and 1918.94F for H2S. That set the permissible exposure limits within longshoring operations. So you look to 1918 for those specific limits.
Okay. So 1910 applies generally, but 1918 has the specific exposure limits for longshoring for those two gases.
You got it. And one more big one. Powered industrial truck operator training. Forklifts, basically. The training requirements from 1910.178 apply directly to longshoring.
Okay, that's a really helpful rundown of how 1910 fits into 1918. Now let's switch gears. Marine terminals, Part 1917.
Right. So for work happening within the defined boundaries of a marine terminal, Part 1917 is the primary exclusive regulation, generally speaking.
Generally speaking, so exceptions here too. Situations where 1917 doesn't apply.
Correct. There are a few specific types of facilities carved out.
Like what?
Well, Part 1917 doesn't cover facilities used only for bulk storage, handling, and transfer of flammable or combustible liquids and gases. Think tank farms, maybe?
Okay, specialized facilities.
Exactly. Also, it doesn't apply to facilities already regulated by the Office of Pipeline Safety under DOT rules, at least where those rules cover the working conditions.
Makes sense. Avoid overlapping jurisdiction.
And finally, fully automated bulk coal handling facilities that are right next to and part of electrical power plants are also excluded.
Okay, so some very specific exclusions. But for your typical marine terminal activities, when does Part 1910 come back into the picture?
Just like with longshoring, there's a list of specific Part 1910 standards that are pulled into Part 1917.
Similar list.
Quite similar in many ways, yes. Things like abrasive blasting, that's 1910.94A, access to exposure and medical records again, commercial diving, and all the electrical safety rules in Subpart S.
Okay. What else from 1910 applies on the terminal side?
Let's see. Grain handling facilities, if they're within the terminal, fall under 1910.272. Hazard communication, again, ionizing and non-ionizing, radiation, noise, respiratory protection. Same ones we mentioned for longshoring often apply here too via 1910.
Makes sense to have consistency there.
It does. Also, safety rules for scaffolding, that's 1910.28. Servicing multi-piece and single-piece rim wheels, think truck tires, that's 1910.177. And again, powered industrial truck operator training from 1910.178.
PIT training seems to be universal then, pulled from 1910.
Pretty much essential everywhere those machines are used, yeah.
And what about toxic and hazardous substances within the marine terminal? Does 1910 Subpart Z apply similarly?
Yes, it does. Subpart Z applies, and you have largely the same exceptions we talked about for longshoring.
Like the sealed packaging exemption for DOT-MO compliant stuff.
Exactly, and the bloodborne pathogen standard. But here's a really key difference, especially for you folks managing safety day to day.
Okay.
Remember how for longshoring, the specific CO and H2S exposure limits were referenced in Part 1918 itself?
Yes, in 1918.94.
Right. Well, for marine terminals, while Subpart Z generally applies, the specific sections detailing the permissible exposure limits for carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide are found within Part 1917. Specifically, 1917.24A for CO and 1917.73A for H2S.
So the reference point for those specific gas limits changes depending on whether you're under 1918 longshoring aboard vessel or 1917 marine terminal.
Precisely. And that's a perfect example of why getting that initial determination right, longshoring versus marine terminal operation, is absolutely critical.
So that really seems to be the core takeaway here for safety professionals, for risk managers. You have to correctly identify if the work falls under longshoring, aboard a vessel, or work within a marine terminal.
Absolutely, because that dictates which primary regulation, 1918 or 1917, you need to follow. Getting it wrong, well, it means you could be implementing the wrong standards.
Which leads to compliance issues, obviously, but more importantly.
More importantly, potential gaps in worker protection. Understanding the distinction directly impacts what safety measures you need, what training you provide, what hazard controls are required.
That QH2QS example really drives that home. Same hazard, different regulatory reference depending on the location.
Exactly. It highlights the practical implication of these scope of definitions.
We should probably also just briefly mention the other players involved, like DOT and IMO.
Good point. While OSHA sets the workplace safety standards here in the U.S., the Department of Transportation and the International Maritime Organization are crucial for regulating how hazardous materials are packaged and contained for transport before they even get to the longshoring operation or terminal.
So their rules ensure safe transit, which then affects how things need to be handled under OSHA rules once they arrive.
That's right. It's an interconnected system.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Can we just quickly summarize that fundamental difference again? 1918 versus 1917.
Sure. The simplest way to think about it is, Part 1918 is primarily for longshoring work aboard the vessel. Part 1917 is primarily for work taking place within the marine terminal on shore.
But everyone needs to remember those specific Part 1910 standards that get pulled into both.
Absolutely critical. Knowing those exceptions, HAZCOM, respiratory protection, PIT training, noise, radiation, record access, and the specific toxic substance rules is just as important as knowing the primary regulation.
So the final thought then for you, our listener, especially if you're in safety or risk management in maritime, use this discussion as your starting point, a foundational map maybe.
Yeah, we've outlined the main territories 1917, 1918, and pointed out those key bridges where 1910 connects them.
Your next step has to be digging into the specifics of 1917 and 1918 that apply directly to your unique operations, what you actually do day to day.
And definitely take the time to look up those specific Part 1910 subparts we mentioned. Understanding how they integrate gives you that complete picture.
It's definitely a complex regulatory landscape, no doubt about it.
For sure.
But hopefully this deep dive has helped untangle some of it and provided some real clarity for you. And if more questions come up as you dig deeper, keep asking, keep researching. That's key.